The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. "I haven't known a woman since 1790, he had whispered, his voice breaking with a vulnerability that made her heart race. James Thompson stood before her in the flickering candlelight of his mountain cabin, this giant of a man who had survived decades alone in the wilderness, trembling like a leaf in an autumn storm. His weathered hands shook as he reached for her, and in that moment, Martha Ramirez understood that she was witnessing something sacred, something that would change both their lives forever. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, we must go back to where it all began. 3 weeks earlier, when Martha's world had crumbled and left her with nowhere to turn but the treacherous mountain paths that led to the most isolated corners of the Colorado Territory. The storm had been building for days, dark clouds gathering like vultures over the Rocky Mountain peaks. Martha pressed her horse forward along the narrow trail, her supplies dwindling and her hope fading with each passing hour. She had been traveling for 2 weeks since fleeing Denver, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the devastating news that had shattered her carefully constructed life. Her husband was dead, killed in a mining accident that had also claimed their life savings and left her with debts she could never repay. The creditors had given her 3 days to vacate their home, and with no family to turn to and no means of support, she had made the desperate decision to head into the mountains, hoping to find work in one of the remote mining camps. The trail grew treacherous as the elevation increased, and Martha's mare stumbled frequently on the loose rocks and hidden roots. The temperature had dropped significantly since morning, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, knowing it would provide little protection against the harsh mountain weather that was surely coming. She had heard stories of travelers who had ventured into these mountains unprepared and were never seen again, their bones picked clean by wolves and bears, their dreams buried beneath the endless snow. As the first fat snowflakes began to fall, Martha realized she had made a terrible mistake. The trail ahead was becoming increasingly difficult to follow, and she could see no signs of civilization anywhere on the horizon. Her horse whinnied nervously, sensing the approaching danger, and Martha felt panic rising in her chest like ice water. She had perhaps an hour of daylight left, and the snow was falling more heavily now, obscuring her vision and making the already treacherous path nearly impossible to navigate. It was then that she saw the smoke rising from a chimney in the distance, a thin gray line against the darkening sky that seemed like a miracle. Martha urged her horse toward the source, praying that whoever lived in this remote location would show mercy to a desperate woman. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow like something from a fairy tale, solid and welcoming with its warm yellow windows glowing in the gathering dusk. Martha dismounted on shaking legs and approached the heavy wooden door, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and terror. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of how she must look after 2 weeks on the trail, her dress torn and dirty, her hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. But the cold was biting through her inadequate clothing, and she had no choice but to seek shelter. Her knock echoed through the stillness, and for a long moment there was no response. Then she heard heavy footsteps approaching, and the door swung open to reveal the largest man she had ever seen. James Thompson stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire doorframe, and arms like tree trunks. His dark hair hung to his shoulders, streaked with gray, and his beard was full and unkempt. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, pale blue and startlingly gentle, in a face that had been weathered by decades of harsh mountain living. For several seconds they simply stared at each other, and Martha saw something flicker across his features that she couldn't quite identify. Surprise, certainly, but something deeper as well, as if he were seeing a ghost from his distant past. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, the words coming slowly, as if he had forgotten how to form them. "You're lost," he said, and it wasn't a question. Martha nodded, not trusting her voice, and James stepped aside to let her enter. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her like an embrace, and she nearly wept with relief as feeling began to return to her frozen fingers and toes. The interior was spartanly furnished but immaculately clean, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and simple wooden furniture arranged with military precision. James helped her remove her wet cloak and guided her to a chair near the fire, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he were handling something infinitely precious and fragile. He disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen and returned with a steaming mug of coffee and a thick woolen blanket, which he draped around her shoulders without a word. "Thank you," Martha whispered, and saw him flinch slightly at the sound of her voice. She realized that this man, living alone in such isolation, probably hadn't heard a woman speak in years, perhaps decades. The thought filled her with a strange mixture of pity and curiosity about what had driven him to such complete solitude. As the warmth seeped back into her bones, Martha studied her rescuer more carefully. Despite his intimidating size and wild appearance, there was something almost courtly in his manner, a careful politeness that spoke of good breeding and education. His clothes, while practical and well-worn, were of good quality, and she noticed that his hands, though calloused and scarred from hard work, were clean and well-maintained. "The storm is getting worse," James said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You'll need to stay until it passes." The words were spoken matter-of-factly, but Martha caught the slight tension in his voice, as if the prospect of extended human company was both welcome and terrifying. "I don't want to impose," she began, but he cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "No imposition," he said firmly. "These mountains don't forgive the unprepared. You would have died out there tonight." The blunt statement sent a chill down Martha's spine, but she knew he was right. She had been foolishly unprepared for the harsh realities of mountain travel, driven by desperation rather than wisdom. Now she found herself completely dependent on the kindness of this mysterious stranger, a situation that would have terrified her under normal circumstances, but somehow felt safe in the warm glow of his firelight. As the evening wore on, James prepared a simple but nourishing meal of venison stew and fresh bread, moving around his kitchen with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to caring for himself. He spoke little, but Martha found his presence oddly comforting, solid and dependable in a way that reminded her of the mountains themselves. When he offered her his bed for the night, insisting he would sleep by the fire, she was too exhausted to argue. The bed was narrow but comfortable, with clean sheets that smelled of pine and mountain air. As Martha lay listening to the wind howling outside and the soft sounds of James banking the fire, she felt safer than she had in weeks. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her desperate flight into the mountains hadn't been a mistake after all. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and the sight of James moving quietly around the kitchen, trying not to disturb her sleep. Sunlight streamed through the small windows, revealing that the storm had passed and left behind a world transformed by fresh snow. The sight was breathtakingly beautiful, but Martha's heart sank as she realized that the trail would now be passable, and she would need to continue her journey. Over breakfast, James asked her about her destination, and Martha found herself telling him the whole sorry tale of her circumstances. She spoke of her husband's death, the crushing debts, her desperate search for work in the mining camps. James listened without interruption, his pale eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Those camps are no place for a woman alone," he said finally. "Men there haven't seen a decent woman in months, sometimes years. They would eat you alive." The harsh words stung, but Martha knew they were true. She had heard stories of the rough mining towns, where violence and lawlessness were commonplace and women were scarce and often treated as commodities rather than human beings. But what choice did she have? She had no skills that would allow her to support herself in civilized society, no family to turn to, no resources beyond her own determination to survive. "I have nowhere else to go," she said quietly, and saw something shift in James's expression. "You could stay here," he said, the words coming out in a rush as if he had surprised himself by speaking them. "I mean, temporarily, until you figure out what to do next." Martha stared at him in shock, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Stay here, in this remote cabin with this strange, solitary man? The idea was scandalous, impossible, and yet something deep inside her responded to the offer, with a longing she hadn't expected. "I couldn't," she began. but James held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," he said, his cheeks flushing slightly. "You could have the cabin. I would build myself a place to sleep in the barn. It's just that winter is coming, and these mountains are unforgiving to those who don't know their ways. You could learn if you stayed, learn to survive up here." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Martha found herself seriously considering it. What did she have to return to? Debt and destitution, the charity of strangers who would judge her for her circumstances? Here, in this beautiful isolation, she might find a different kind of life, one where her past didn't define her future. Over the next few days, as Martha recovered from her ordeal and helped James with the daily tasks of mountain living, she began to understand the rhythm of his solitary existence. He rose before dawn to tend to his small herd of goats and chickens, chopped wood for the fire, hunted and trapped for meat, and maintained his cabin and outbuildings with the meticulous care of someone who understood that survival depended on preparation and attention to detail. Martha found herself drawn into this routine, helping where she could and learning skills she had never imagined she would need. James taught her how to milk the goats, how to preserve meat for the long winter months, how to read the signs in the sky that predicted changes in the weather. He was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish for her ignorance, and she found herself looking forward to their quiet conversations as they worked side by side. Gradually, she began to piece together fragments of his story. He had been a soldier once, she gathered, though he never spoke directly of his military service. There were hints in the way he moved, the precision of his daily routines, the careful way he maintained his weapons. She also sensed that he had known great loss, though the details remained locked away behind walls of silence that she didn't dare breach. James, for his part, seemed to come alive in ways that suggested he had been slowly dying of loneliness without realizing it. His movements became less guarded, his rare smiles more frequent, and sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. The work was hard, harder than anything Martha had ever done in her previous life as a town wife. But she found a deep satisfaction in the simple tasks that kept them fed and warm and safe. There was something profoundly honest about this existence, stripped of the pretenses and complications of civilized society, reduced to the basic elements of survival and companionship. As the days turned into weeks, Martha found herself settling into the rhythm of mountain life with surprising ease. She had always thought of herself as delicate, unsuited for physical labor, but under James's patient tutelage, she discovered reserves of strength and capability she hadn't known she possessed. Her hands grew calloused from chopping wood and hauling water. Her muscles hardened from the constant physical demands, and her complexion took on the healthy glow of someone who spent her days in the fresh mountain air. James watched these changes with obvious approval, and Martha began to understand that he saw in her something she had never seen in herself. To him, she wasn't a helpless widow in need of rescue, but a strong woman capable of adapting and thriving in even the harshest circumstances. The realization was both empowering and terrifying, forcing her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about herself. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a particularly difficult day of preparing for winter, James broke the comfortable silence with a question that caught her off guard. "What was your husband like?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Martha was quiet for a long time, considering how to answer. Her marriage had been arranged by her father, a practical union between two respectable families, and while she had cared for her husband, she wasn't sure she had ever truly loved him. He had been kind enough but distant, more concerned with his business affairs than with building a deep connection with his wife. "He was a good man," she said finally, "but we never really knew each other, not deeply. Our marriage was more of a business arrangement than a love match." James nodded, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "That life?" Martha considered the question seriously. Did she miss the comfortable house, the social obligations, the predictable routine of her former existence? Or did she miss the security it had represented, the illusion of safety that had been shattered so completely by her husband's death? "I miss feeling safe," she admitted, "but I don't miss feeling invisible." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise James. She hadn't realized until she spoke them how true they were. In her former life, she had been defined entirely by her relationship to others, first as her father's daughter, then as her husband's wife. Here, in this isolated cabin, she was discovering who Martha Ramirez was when stripped of all those external definitions. James studied her face in the firelight, and she saw something kindle in his pale eyes that made her breath catch. "You're not invisible here," he said quietly. The simple words carried a weight that made Martha's heart race. She looked at this man who had taken her in without question, who had shared his food and shelter and knowledge without asking for anything in return. And she realized that somewhere along the way, her gratitude had transformed into something much deeper and more dangerous. As winter tightened its grip on the mountains, Martha and James were forced into even closer quarters, their world shrinking to the warm circle of firelight that held back the bitter cold and howling winds. The intimacy of their situation was both thrilling and terrifying, charged with an undercurrent of attraction that neither of them dared to acknowledge openly. Martha found herself studying James when she thought he wasn't looking, noting the way his muscles moved beneath his shirt as he worked, the gentle way he handled injured animals, the rare moments when his guard dropped completely and she glimpsed the lonely man beneath the stoic exterior. She began to understand that his isolation wasn't entirely by choice, that something in his past had driven him to this remote sanctuary where he could hide from whatever demons pursued him. One particularly brutal night, when the wind was howling like a living thing and the cabin shook with each gust, Martha woke to find James standing at the window, staring out into the storm with an expression of such profound sadness that it took her breath away. She rose from her bed and moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. And he turned to look at her with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades. "Storms like this remind me of things I'd rather forget," he said, his voice barely audible above the wind. Martha waited, sensing that he was on the verge of sharing something important, but after a long moment he simply shook his head and turned away from the window. She reached out instinctively and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles, the carefully controlled strength that she now knew he would never use to harm her. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she said, the words coming from some deep well of compassion she hadn't known existed. James looked down at her hand on his arm, and she saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. For a moment she thought he might speak, might finally share whatever burden he had been carrying all these years. But instead he simply covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and surprisingly gentle for such a large man. They stood like that for several minutes, connected by touch and shared silence, and Martha felt something fundamental shift between them. The careful politeness that had characterized their interactions was giving way to something deeper, more honest, and infinitely more dangerous. In the days that followed, Martha became increasingly aware of the subtle changes in their dynamic. James's eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, and she caught herself watching him with an intensity that would have scandalized her former self. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, every accidental touch sending sparks through her nervous system. She had never experienced anything like this with her husband, this constant awareness of another person, this magnetic pull that seemed to draw her closer despite all her attempts at propriety. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, this awakening of desires she had thought herself incapable of feeling. James, meanwhile, seemed to be fighting his own internal battle. She could see it in the way he sometimes caught himself staring at her, the quick flush that would color his cheeks when their hands brushed while passing tools or dishes. He was unfailingly respectful, never crossing any lines of propriety, but Martha could sense the effort it cost him to maintain that distance. The tension came to a head one evening when Martha was helping James repair a harness by the fire. Their heads were bent close together over the leather work, and she became acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his breath on her cheek, the clean scent of pine and wood smoke that seemed to cling to his skin. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse race. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, suspended in the space between heartbeats, and Martha felt herself leaning toward him as if drawn by some invisible force. James pulled back abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair in his haste to put distance between them. "I should check on the animals," he said roughly, grabbing his coat and fleeing into the night as if pursued by demons. Martha sat alone by the fire, her heart pounding and her cheeks burning with embarrassment and unfulfilled longing. She understood now that whatever was building between them was as frightening to him as it was to her, perhaps more so. A man who had lived in isolation for decades would naturally be wary of the complications that emotional attachment could bring. But she also sensed that his retreat wasn't just about fear of intimacy. There was something else, some deeper wound that made him believe he didn't deserve happiness or companionship. The thought filled her with a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. When James returned an hour later, they both pretended that nothing had happened, but the careful politeness felt strained now, artificial. Martha went to bed early, claiming fatigue, but she lay awake for hours listening to James moving restlessly around the cabin, unable to settle. The next morning brought news that would change everything. James returned from his weekly trip to the nearest trading post with supplies and a grim expression that immediately put Martha on alert. "There's trouble coming," he said without preamble. "Word is that a gang of outlaws has been working their way through the mountain settlements, robbing and killing anyone who gets in their way. They hit the Murphy place 3 days ago." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. She had met the Murphys during her journey, a kind elderly couple who had given her directions to the main trail. "Are they—" "Dead," James confirmed grimly, along with anyone else who was there. "These aren't ordinary thieves, Martha. They're killers, and they're heading this way." The news cast a shadow over their previously peaceful existence, and Martha found herself jumping at every sound, every creak of the cabin settling or branch scraping against the roof. James immediately began making preparations for a possible attack, checking his weapons and reinforcing the cabin's defenses with a military precision that revealed more about his past than he had ever shared in words. As they worked together to prepare for the potential threat, Martha found herself studying James with new eyes. The way he moved, the tactical thinking that went into every decision, the casual competence with which he handled weapons all spoke of extensive military experience. But more than that, she sensed in him the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from seeing too much violence, losing too much. That evening, as they sat cleaning weapons by the fire, Martha finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. "What happened to you out there?" she asked quietly. "What made you come to these mountains?" James's hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning, and for a long moment Martha thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to strain to hear it. "I was a soldier," he said, "fought in the Indian Wars, then later in some conflicts that don't have names in the history books. I was good at it, too good. Killing became easy, natural. And then one day I looked around and realized I didn't recognize the man I'd become." He set down the rifle and stared into the fire, his face carved from stone. "I came up here to get away from that man, to find some peace. Been here 15 years now, and most days I managed to forget what I was before." The raw honesty in his voice made Martha's chest tight with emotion. She could see the pain he carried, the weight of memories that would never fully fade. And she understood now why he had chosen this isolated existence. He wasn't just hiding from the world, he was hiding from himself. "You're not that man anymore," she said firmly. "The James Thompson I know is gentle and kind and protective. He saves lost travelers and teaches city women how to survive in the mountains. He tends injured animals and shares his food without expecting anything in return." James looked at her then, and she saw something vulnerable and desperate in his pale eyes. "You don't know what I've done," he said, "the things I'm capable of." "I know what you've chosen not to do," Martha replied. "I know that you could have taken advantage of a desperate woman who showed up at your door, but instead you gave her safety and respect and a chance to find herself. I know that you've spent 15 years trying to atone for whatever happened in your past, and that has to count for something." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze, the distant whinny of horses on the mountain trail. James was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, his entire demeanor transformed from gentle protector to deadly warrior in the space of a heartbeat. "Get away from the windows," he ordered, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Take the pistol from the drawer and get behind the bed. If anyone comes through that door who isn't me, shoot first and ask questions later." Martha did as he instructed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she crouched behind the bed with the heavy pistol in her trembling hands. Through the small window, she could see James moving like a shadow around the perimeter of the cabin, using the darkness and his knowledge of the terrain to his advantage. The riders approached slowly, and Martha could hear their voices carrying on the still mountain air. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more, and their conversation was punctuated by crude laughter that made her skin crawl. They had found the cabin, and they were planning to take whatever they wanted. James appeared at the window, his face grim but determined. "There are 6 of them," he whispered. "They're armed and looking for trouble. I'm going to try to lead them away from the cabin, but if something happens to me, you take the horse and ride hard for the trading post. Don't stop for anything." Before Martha could protest, he was gone, melting back into the darkness like smoke. She pressed her face to the window, trying to track his movements. But he had become invisible, a ghost in his own domain. The attack began with a shout from one of the outlaws, followed by the crack of gunfire. Martha heard James return fire from somewhere in the trees, his shots precise and deadly. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the shadows of the mountain forest. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was deafening. Martha waited, scarcely breathing, for some sign that James had survived. When she finally heard his voice calling her name, she nearly collapsed with relief. The outlaws were gone. 3 of them dead and the others fled into the night. But James had paid a price for the victory. He stumbled into the cabin with blood seeping through his shirt, a bullet wound in his shoulder that he was trying to minimize, but which Martha could see was serious. She immediately took charge, her fear transforming into focused determination as she helped him remove his shirt and examine the wound. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but he had lost a significant amount of blood and would need careful tending to avoid infection. As she cleaned and bandaged the wound, Martha found herself marveling at the trust James was showing her, allowing her to see him vulnerable and dependent on her care. His skin was marked with old scars, a roadmap of violence and survival that told the story of his past more clearly than words ever could. "You saved us," she said softly as she worked. "You saved me." James winced as she tightened the bandage, but his eyes never left her face. "I told you I was good at killing," he said, but there was no pride in his voice, only a deep sadness that made Martha's heart ache. "You protected us," she corrected firmly. "There's a difference." As Martha nursed James back to health over the following days, their relationship underwent another fundamental shift. The crisis had stripped away the last of their pretenses, forcing them to confront the depth of their feelings for each other. Martha found herself treasuring every moment of caring for him, every opportunity to show him the tenderness he had been denied for so many years. James, weakened by his injury and fever, let his guard down in ways that revealed the man beneath the warrior's facade. He spoke of his childhood, his family lost to disease and war, the dreams he had abandoned when violence became his profession. Martha listened to these whispered confessions with a growing understanding of the complex, damaged, beautiful man who had become the center of her world. On the 3rd night after the attack, as Martha sat beside his bed monitoring his fever, James reached out and took her hand with fingers that trembled slightly from weakness and something deeper. "I haven't known a woman since 1790, he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his soul. "Haven't let myself get close to anyone, because I was afraid of what I might bring into their life." Martha felt tears prick her eyes at the raw vulnerability in his voice. She could see the internal battle he was fighting, the war between his desire for connection and his fear of causing harm to someone he cared about. "You're not going to hurt me, James," she said softly, bringing his hand to her lips and pressing a gentle kiss to his knuckles. "You're the gentlest man I've ever known." But James shook his head, his eyes dark with old pain. "You don't understand," he said. "The things I've done, the man I was, I don't deserve someone like you." The words broke Martha's heart, but they also ignited a fierce anger at whatever had convinced this good man that he was beyond redemption. She leaned closer, her free hand coming up to cup his bearded cheek. "Listen to me," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. "I don't care what you did before I met you. The man I know is honorable and kind and brave. The man I know risked his life to protect me from killers. The man I know has spent 15 years trying to become someone worthy of forgiveness, and he succeeded a long time ago." James stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language, as if the concept of his own worthiness was so foreign he couldn't comprehend it. But Martha could see something shifting in his expression, a crack in the wall of self-condemnation he had built around his heart. "I love you," she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could lose her courage. "I love your gentleness and your strength and your wounded heart. I love the way you see the good in everything around you, except yourself. And I'm not going anywhere, no matter what you think you deserve." The confession hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Martha held her breath as she waited for his response. For a moment, James simply stared at her as if she were an apparition, something too good to be real. Then slowly, wonderingly, he reached up to touch her face. "Martha," he breathed, and she could hear a lifetime of longing in the way he spoke her name. She leaned into his touch, her heart racing as she saw the last of his defenses crumble. When he drew her down to him, she went willingly, their lips meeting in a kiss that was gentle and desperate and full of all the words they hadn't been able to say. The kiss deepened, and Martha felt herself melting into him, her body responding to his touch in ways that were completely foreign to her previous experience. With her husband, intimacy had been dutiful, perfunctory, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. But with James, every touch sent fire through her veins, every caress awakening desires she hadn't known she possessed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, James searched her face with an expression of wonder and disbelief. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Once we cross this line, there's no going back." Martha smiled, her hand coming up to trace the strong line of his jaw. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," she said. "I want to be yours, James. Completely." The words seemed to break something loose inside him, and he pulled her down for another kiss, this one hungrier, more demanding. Martha responded with equal passion, her body arching against his as he rolled her beneath him, mindful of his injured shoulder, but unable to resist the pull of desire that had been building between them for weeks. What followed was a revelation for Martha, an awakening of sensuality and passion that transformed her understanding of what physical intimacy could be. James worshipped her body with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, his touch gentle but sure, as he showed her pleasures she had never imagined possible. Afterwards, they lay entwined in the narrow bed, Martha's head pillowed on James's uninjured shoulder as the fire crackled softly in the hearth. She had never felt so complete, so perfectly matched to another human being, and she could see in James's face that he was experiencing something similar. "I never thought I would feel this way again," he murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Never thought I deserved to feel this way." "You deserve everything good this world has to offer," Martha replied, pressing a kiss to his chest. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." James tightened his arms around her, and Martha could feel some fundamental tension leaving his body, as if he were finally allowing himself to believe in the possibility of happiness. They talked quietly into the night, sharing dreams and fears and plans for the future, building the foundation of a life together in this remote mountain sanctuary. As winter gave way to spring, Martha and James settled into their new reality as partners in every sense of the word. The physical passion between them remained strong, but it was built on a foundation of deep emotional connection and mutual respect that made every day feel like a gift. Martha continued to grow stronger and more capable, her city softness replaced by the lean muscle and quiet confidence of a mountain woman. James, meanwhile, seemed to come alive in ways that suggested he had been slowly dying of loneliness without realizing it. His rare smiles became more frequent, his laughter easier, and sometimes Martha would catch him watching her with an expression of such profound gratitude that it took her breath away. They worked together to expand the cabin, adding rooms and improvements that would accommodate their growing partnership. James taught Martha to hunt and trap, to read the weather signs and navigate the treacherous mountain trails. In return, she brought a warmth and humanity to his existence that had been missing for far too long. The isolation that had once been James's sanctuary became their shared paradise, a place where they could build a life free from the judgments and expectations of civilized society. They were completely self-sufficient, dependent only on each other and the harsh but beautiful land that surrounded them. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountain peaks, Martha brought up a subject that had been on her mind for weeks. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked. "To civilization, I mean." James considered the question seriously, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I think about showing you off to the world, letting everyone see what a remarkable woman I've found. But then I remember what the world is like, how it judges and condemns and tries to put people into neat little boxes." Martha nodded, understanding his reluctance. She had no desire to return to a society that would condemn their unconventional relationship, that would see her as a fallen woman for living unmarried with a man. Here, in their mountain sanctuary, they could simply be themselves without apology or explanation. "Besides," James continued, his voice taking on a note of wonder, "I have everything I need right here. A woman who loves me despite my past, a life built on honest work and simple pleasures, and the most beautiful view in the world to wake up to every morning." He turned to look at her then, his pale eyes soft with love and contentment. What more could a man ask for? Martha smiled and leaned into his embrace, her heart full to bursting with happiness and gratitude. She thought of the desperate, frightened woman who had stumbled onto his doorstep months ago, and marveled at how much they had both changed. That woman had been seeking shelter from a storm, but she had found something infinitely more valuable, a love that had transformed them both. As the seasons turned and their first year together gave way to their second, Martha and James faced the challenges of mountain life with the confidence of a well-matched team. They weathered blizzards and drought, dealt with predators and illness, and celebrated the small victories that made their isolated existence not just bearable, but deeply fulfilling. Martha discovered that she had a talent for healing, learning to use the mountain plants and herbs to treat everything from minor cuts to serious illness. James, meanwhile, found new purpose in protecting and providing for the woman he loved, his military skills channeled into keeping them safe and prosperous in their remote domain. Their physical relationship deepened and evolved as well, the initial passion giving way to a more mature intimacy built on trust and understanding. They learned each other's bodies with the thoroughness of lovers who had all the time in the world, finding new ways to give and receive pleasure that left them both breathless and grateful. But it was the emotional intimacy that truly transformed them both. James gradually opened up about his past, sharing stories of his childhood, his military service, and the events that had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains. Martha listened without judgment, offering comfort when the memories became too painful, and celebrating the strength that had allowed him to survive and eventually find peace. In return, Martha found herself able to speak honestly about her own past for the first time in her life. She told James about the loneliness of her marriage, the suffocating expectations of society, and her secret dreams of a life lived on her own terms. He listened with the same non-judgmental acceptance she had shown him, validating her experiences and helping her understand that her desire for independence and authenticity was not a character flaw, but a strength. One morning in their second summer together, Martha woke to find James already up and moving around the cabin with unusual energy. When she emerged from their bedroom, she found him pacing nervously by the fire, his hands fidgeting with something small and metallic. "James," she asked, concerned by his obvious agitation, "is everything all right?" He turned to look at her, and she saw that his face was flushed with emotion. "Martha," he said, his voice unsteady, "I know we've talked about not needing the world's approval for what we have, but there's something I want to ask you." He dropped to one knee then, producing a simple gold band that Martha recognized as having been crafted from a nugget he had found in the stream that ran behind their cabin. His hands shook as he held it out to her, and his voice broke slightly as he spoke. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "I know it won't be legal without a preacher, but I want to make vows to you before God and these mountains that have brought us together. I want to promise to love and protect and cherish you for as long as I draw breath." Martha felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at this strong, gentle man kneeling before her with his heart in his hands. The ring was rough and imperfect, crafted with more love than skill, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, her voice ringing with joy and certainty. "Yes, James Thompson, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then rose to sweep her into his arms, spinning her around the cabin as they both laughed and cried with happiness. When he finally set her down, they were both breathless and giddy with the magnitude of the commitment they had just made. They spoke their vows that evening as the sun set over the mountain peaks, their words simple but heartfelt as they promised to love and honor each other for all the days of their lives. There were no witnesses except the wind in the pines and the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, but Martha had never felt anything more sacred or binding. As their second year together turned into their third, Martha and James faced their greatest challenge yet when a late spring blizzard trapped them in the cabin for nearly 2 weeks. Supplies ran low, and James was forced to venture out into the dangerous conditions to hunt for food, leaving Martha alone for hours at a time while she worried about his safety. It was during one of these solitary vigils that Martha discovered she was pregnant, the realization hitting her like a thunderbolt as she sat by the fire mending clothes. She had been feeling unwell for weeks, attributing her nausea and fatigue to the stress of the prolonged storm, but as she counted back the days, the truth became undeniable. When James returned that evening with a deer slung over his shoulders, Martha met him at the door with tears streaming down her face. For a moment he thought something terrible had happened, dropping the deer and pulling her into his arms with urgent concern. "What is it?" he demanded. "Are you hurt? Sick?" Martha shook her head, unable to find the words to share the momentous news. Instead, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach, watching his face as understanding dawned. "A baby?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe and wonder. Martha nodded, and James let out a whoop of joy that echoed through the cabin. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying as they celebrated the new life growing inside her. But as the initial euphoria faded, practical concerns began to surface. They were miles from the nearest doctor, and Martha had no experience with childbirth beyond the basic knowledge passed down from her mother. James, despite his many skills, was equally unprepared for the challenges of bringing a child into the world in such isolation. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly when Martha voiced her fears. "We've faced everything else together. And we'll face this too. Our child will be born free and wild, like the mountains themselves." As Martha's pregnancy progressed, James became even more protective and attentive, if such a thing were possible. He researched everything he could about childbirth, trading for medical books at the distant trading post and consulting with the few women in the scattered mountain settlements who had experience with such matters. Martha, meanwhile, found herself changing in ways that went beyond the physical transformation of her body. She felt connected to something ancient and primal, a chain of mothers stretching back through time, all of whom had faced the same fears and hopes she was experiencing. The thought gave her strength and confidence, even as her body grew heavy and unwieldy with their child. James crafted a cradle from mountain cedar, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he carved intricate designs into the wood. Martha sewed tiny clothes from soft wool and cotton, her heart swelling with love for the child she had yet to meet. They spent long evenings by the fire discussing names and dreams, planning for a future that would include a third member of their mountain family. The birth came on a night when the autumn winds howled through the peaks like banshees, as if the mountains themselves were celebrating the arrival of a new child of the wilderness. Martha labored for hours with James beside her, his steady presence and gentle encouragement giving her the strength to push through the pain and fear. When their daughter finally arrived, slippery and perfect, and screaming with outrage at being thrust into the cold world, both parents wept with relief and overwhelming love. James cut the cord with hands that shook with emotion, then wrapped the baby in the soft blankets Martha had prepared. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with tears, as he placed their daughter in Martha's arms. "Perfect and beautiful, just like her mother." Martha looked down at the tiny face, already seeing James's eyes and her own stubborn chin, and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. This child was the product of their love, the living symbol of the life they had built together in their mountain sanctuary. They named her Grace for the unexpected gift she represented in their lives, and she grew strong and healthy in the clean mountain air. James proved to be a devoted father, his warrior's hands gentle as he cradled his daughter, his deep voice soft as he sang her to sleep with old songs his own father had taught him decades ago. Martha watched her husband with their child and marveled at this new dimension of the man she loved. The tenderness he showed Grace revealed depths of nurturing she had always suspected but never fully appreciated. Here was a man who had spent years believing himself unworthy of love, now pouring all his capacity for care and protection into the tiny being who had made him a father. As Grace grew from infant to toddler, she became the bright center of their mountain world. She took her first steps on the wooden floors James had crafted with his own hands, spoke her first words in the cabin where her parents had found their love, and learned to walk before she could properly talk by following her father around as he did his daily chores. The child was fearless in the way that only mountain children could be, comfortable with heights and wild animals, and the vast silences that might have frightened city children. She learned to identify edible plants before she could read, could track animals through the forest while other children her age were learning their letters. James and Martha took turns teaching her, sharing the knowledge that had allowed them to not just survive, but thrive in their isolated existence. She learned to read from the few precious books they owned, to write with charcoal on smooth pieces of bark, to calculate using pebbles and pine cones as counters. But more than practical skills, Grace absorbed the values that had made her parents' relationship so strong: honesty, respect, self-reliance, and the deep understanding that love was something to be earned through daily acts of kindness and consideration, rather than demanded as a right. As Grace approached her 5th birthday, Martha and James began to discuss the question that had been lurking in the back of their minds since her birth. What kind of future could they offer their daughter in such isolation? They had chosen this life for themselves, but Grace had been born into it without choice, and they wondered if they had the right to keep her from the broader world indefinitely. The question became more urgent when a traveling preacher arrived at their cabin one autumn day, the first visitor they had received in over 2 years. Reverend Benjamin Cox was an elderly man who traveled the mountain circuits, bringing religious services to the scattered settlements and homesteads that dotted the remote regions. He was shocked to discover their unmarried state, despite the obvious love and commitment between them in the presence of their daughter. In his view, they were living in sin, and Grace was suffering the consequences of their moral failings. "This child needs proper schooling," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of moral certainty. "She needs to be around other children, needs to learn proper Christian values. You're denying her the chance at a decent life by keeping her up here like some kind of wild animal." The words stung because they echoed Martha's own secret fears about their choices. Was she being selfish in wanting to keep Grace in their mountain paradise? Was James's desire to protect their daughter from the world's judgments actually harming her development? James, predictably, was less concerned with the preacher's moral pronouncements than with the practical implications of his visit. The fact that word of their existence had spread far enough to reach the traveling circuits meant that their isolation was no longer as complete as they had believed. Other visitors might follow, bringing with them the complications and judgments they had worked so hard to escape. After the preacher left, promising to return in the spring with proper documentation to perform a legal marriage ceremony, Martha and James spent long hours discussing their daughter's future. Grace, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the adult concerns swirling around her, content to play with her carved wooden toys and help with the daily chores that kept their household running. "I don't want her to be ashamed of us," Martha said one evening, as they sat by the fire after Grace had gone to bed. "I don't want her to grow up thinking there's something wrong with the life we've built here." "There's nothing wrong with our life," James replied firmly. "We love each other. We've raised our daughter with care and attention. We've built something honest and good. The fact that some people can't see that doesn't make it less true. But Martha's concerns went deeper than social approval. She worried about Grace's future prospects, her ability to function in the wider world if she chose to leave the mountains someday. What kind of husband would want a woman who had been raised in such unconventional circumstances? What opportunities would be available to someone with no formal education or social connections? These fears came to a head the following spring when Grace suffered a serious injury while playing near the stream behind their cabin. She slipped on wet rocks and struck her head, losing consciousness for several terrifying minutes. When she finally came around, she seemed confused and disoriented, and Martha realized with sick certainty that their daughter needed medical attention beyond what they could provide. The nearest doctor was a 2-day ride through treacherous mountain passes, and James made the journey in record time, carrying Grace in his arms while Martha rode beside them, praying with every mile that they wouldn't be too late. The doctor, an elderly man named Donald Ward, who had been serving the mountain communities for decades, examined Grace with gentle thoroughness and pronounced her likely to recover fully. But the incident had shaken all three of them profoundly. As they made the return journey to their cabin, Martha found herself looking at their isolated existence with new eyes. What if Grace's injury had been more serious? What if she had needed surgery or specialized care that simply wasn't available in their remote location? The thought of losing their daughter because of their choices was almost unbearable. James, sensing her internal struggle, reached over to take her hand as they rode side by side along the familiar trail. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "Whatever needs to be done for Grace's sake, we'll figure it out together." The conversation that followed stretched over several weeks as Martha and James weighed their options and considered what changes they might need to make to their lives. They could move closer to civilization, perhaps to one of the larger towns in the valley, but that would mean giving up the independence and privacy that had become so precious to them. Alternatively, they could arrange for Grace to spend part of each year with relatives or family friends in more populated areas, giving her access to formal education and social experiences while allowing her to return to the mountains for the rest of the time. But Martha had no living relatives she trusted, and James's family had been dead for decades. The solution, when it came, was unexpected and came from Grace herself. Now old enough to understand the discussion swirling around her future, she approached her parents one evening with the serious expression she wore when grappling with important questions. "I don't want to leave," she announced with the simple certainty of childhood. "This is my home. These are my mountains. Why would I want to go somewhere else?" Martha knelt down to her daughter's level, trying to explain the complexities of adult concerns in terms a 5-year-old could understand. But Grace interrupted her with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Are you happy here, Mama?" she asked. "Is Papa happy here?" "Yes," Martha admitted. "We're very happy here." "Then why would we leave?" Grace asked with unassailable 5-year-old logic. "If we're happy and we love each other and we have everything we need, why would we go somewhere else just because other people think we should?" The simple wisdom of the question stopped Martha short, and she looked up to see James watching their daughter with an expression of profound pride and love. In that moment, Martha realized that their mountain-raised child had already internalized the values that mattered most: the importance of love over convention, happiness over social approval, authenticity over conformity. Over the following months, Martha and James made adjustments to their lifestyle that addressed their concerns about Grace's education and social development without requiring them to abandon the life they had built. James arranged for periodic visits from the traveling teacher who served the scattered mountain communities, ensuring that Grace would receive formal instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic. Martha, meanwhile, began corresponding with other mountain families, creating a network of relationships that would provide Grace with opportunities to interact with other children her age during seasonal gatherings and community events. These connections also served as a safety net, ensuring that help would be available in case of medical emergencies or other crises. The changes required some sacrifice of their cherished privacy, but Martha and James found that the benefits outweighed the costs. Grace thrived with the additional stimulation in social interaction, while still maintaining her deep connection to the mountain environment that had shaped her early years. As the years passed, their daughter grew into a remarkable young woman who combined the best qualities of both her parents. She had Martha's intelligence and emotional depth, James's strength and practical skills, and a unique perspective shaped by her unconventional upbringing. She was equally comfortable tracking deer through dense forests and discussing literature by firelight, equally capable of delivering a difficult birth among the goats and solving complex mathematical problems. Most importantly, Grace had absorbed her parents' understanding that love was the foundation of any meaningful life, that authentic relationships mattered more than social status, and that happiness was something to be created rather than pursued. She watched her parents' relationship with the keen observation of a child raised in close quarters, learning from their example what it meant to be truly committed to another person. When Grace turned 16, she surprised her parents by announcing that she wanted to spend a year in Denver, living with a family friend and attending a formal school. Martha's first instinct was panic at the thought of her daughter venturing into the world that had once seemed so threatening, but James supported Grace's decision with characteristic calm. "She needs to see what's out there," he said when Martha expressed her concerns. "She needs to make her own choices about what kind of life she wants to live. If we've raised her right, she'll know where she belongs." The year of separation was difficult for all three of them, but Grace's letters home were filled with observations about city life that revealed the wisdom of her mountain upbringing. She wrote about the loneliness she observed in people who were surrounded by crowds, the emptiness of relationships based on social advantage rather than genuine affection, the way material wealth seemed to create as many problems as it solved. When she returned home the following summer, Grace was more mature and worldly, but also more certain than ever that her heart belonged in the mountains. She had seen what civilization had to offer, and while she appreciated the opportunities and experiences it provided, she had no desire to make it her permanent home. "I want what you and Papa have," she told Martha as they worked together in the garden behind their cabin. "I want a love that's real and deep and honest. I want to build something meaningful with my own hands. I want to wake up every morning in a place that feels like home." Martha felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to her daughter's words, recognizing in them the echo of her own journey from desperate widow to fulfilled mountain woman. Grace had seen both worlds and chosen the one that offered the greatest possibility for authentic happiness, just as Martha had done nearly 2 decades earlier. That autumn brought news that would test their family's bonds in unexpected ways. Word came through the mountain network that a railroad was being built through the valley below their cabin, bringing with it the promise of easier access to supplies and markets, but also the threat of increased development and population growth. James received an offer from a mining company that wanted to lease portions of their land for mineral exploration, an offer that would have made them wealthy by any standard. The money would have ensured Grace's future security, provided funds for her education or marriage, and given them resources they had never dreamed of possessing. But wealth had never been their goal, and James turned down the offer without hesitation. The mountains were not just their home. They were their sanctuary, their refuge from a world that valued profit over beauty, acquisition over contentment. No amount of money was worth sacrificing the peace and freedom they had found in their isolated paradise. The decision sparked the first serious disagreement Martha and James had experienced in their years together. Martha worried about Grace's future, about the opportunities they might be denying her by refusing the mining company's offer. She had grown up in poverty and knew the security that money could provide, the doors it could open, the problems it could solve. James, meanwhile, saw the offer as a threat to everything they had built together. He had witnessed firsthand what greed and materialism could do to people and communities, had seen the corruption that followed in the wake of easy money. Their mountain sanctuary was precious precisely because it existed outside the reach of such influences. The argument continued for days, with both parents presenting their cases passionately while trying not to involve Grace in their disagreement. But their daughter was too observant and too much a part of their lives to remain ignorant of the conflict, and she finally confronted them with characteristic directness. "You're both right," she said, interrupting one of their heated discussions. "Papa's right that money can't buy the kind of happiness we have here. But Mama's right that I should have choices about my future, and those choices might require resources we don't currently have." She paused, looking from one parent to the other, with a serious expression that had become familiar to them over the years. "But there's a third option you haven't considered," she continued. "What if we take enough of their money to secure my future and invest in improvements that would make our life here even better, but not so much that it changes who we are or what we value?" The compromise Grace suggested proved to be the perfect solution to their dilemma. James negotiated a limited agreement with the mining company that would provide them with enough resources to ensure Grace's security and education while preserving the essential character of their mountain home. The money allowed them to make improvements to their cabin and outbuildings, to purchase better equipment and supplies, and to establish a fund that would support Grace's future endeavors, whatever they might be. More importantly, the agreement included strict environmental protections that would prevent the mining company from damaging the pristine wilderness that surrounded their home. James had learned enough about legal matters over the years to ensure that their sanctuary would remain inviolate regardless of what happened with the mining operation. The resolution of the conflict brought Martha and James closer together than ever, as they realized that their brief disagreement had actually demonstrated the strength of their relationship rather than revealing any fundamental incompatibility. They had been able to argue passionately about something that mattered deeply to both of them, then work together to find a solution that honored both their concerns. Grace, meanwhile, had proven herself to be not just their daughter, but their equal partner in making decisions about their family's future. Her wisdom and maturity impressed both parents and made them realize that their unconventional child-rearing approach had produced exactly the kind of young woman they had hoped to raise: independent, thoughtful, and capable of making difficult decisions with grace and intelligence. As Grace entered her late teens, she began to attract the attention of young men from the various mountain communities, much to James's protective dismay and Martha's amused concern. Their daughter had grown into a striking young woman who combined physical beauty with intelligence and capability in ways that made her irresistible to the sons of ranchers, miners, and homesteaders throughout the region. But Grace proved to be as discerning in matters of the heart as she was in everything else, showing little interest in the conventional young men who pursued her with varying degrees of subtlety and success. She had grown up watching the deep, authentic love between her parents, and she was unwilling to settle for anything less meaningful in her own relationships. The young man who finally captured Grace's attention was as unconventional as she was. Jose Sanders was the son of a Mexican rancher and a Cheyenne woman, a mixed heritage that made him an outsider in most communities but gave him a unique perspective on life in the American West. He was intelligent, hardworking, and possessed of a quiet strength that reminded Martha powerfully of James in his younger days. When Jose asked for permission to court Grace, James subjected him to the kind of intensive questioning usually reserved for military interrogations. But the young man answered every question with honesty and dignity, demonstrating the kind of character and values that James respected. More importantly, Grace clearly cared for him, and James had learned over the years to trust his daughter's judgment implicitly. The courtship that followed was conducted with the same deliberate care that characterized everything important in their mountain community. Jose visited regularly, participating in the daily work of their homestead and proving himself capable of the kind of partnership that mountain life required. Martha watched the developing relationship with the satisfaction of a mother who sees her child making wise choices. When Jose finally proposed, it was with a ring he had crafted himself from silver mined in the mountains, set with a stone he had found in the same stream where James had discovered the gold for Martha's wedding band. The symbolism was not lost on any of them, and Martha felt her heart swell with happiness as she watched her daughter accept the proposal with tears of joy. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and the entire mountain community began preparing for what would be the largest celebration the region had seen in years. Martha threw herself into the preparations with enthusiasm, determined to give her daughter the kind of wedding that would honor both her unconventional upbringing and her bright future. James, meanwhile, struggled with the mixed emotions that came with seeing his little girl preparing to become a wife. He was proud of the woman Grace had become and approved of her choice in Jose, but he also felt the inevitable sadness of a father watching his child take the next step toward independence. As the wedding day approached, Martha found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. She thought of the desperate, frightened woman who had stumbled onto James's doorstep nearly 20 years earlier, seeking nothing more than shelter from a storm. That woman could never have imagined the rich, full life that awaited her in the mountains, the deep love she would find with a man who had given up on happiness, the joy of raising a daughter who would grow into everything they had hoped she might become. The wedding itself was everything Martha had dreamed it would be and more. Grace looked radiant in the dress Martha had sewn from silk purchased with their mining money, and Jose was handsome and nervous in his best suit. James performed the ceremony himself, having obtained the necessary legal authority through their connections in the territorial government, and his voice was steady and strong as he pronounced the young couple husband and wife. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days, with guests arriving from settlements throughout the mountain region. There was music and dancing, storytelling and laughter, and the kind of genuine community joy that reminded everyone present why they had chosen to make their lives in this remote and challenging place. As Martha watched her daughter dance with her new husband, she felt James's arm slip around her waist, and she leaned into the familiar warmth and strength of his embrace. They had built something beautiful together, something that would continue to grow and flourish through their daughter and the generations that would follow. "I love you," James whispered in her ear, the same words he had spoken on that night so many years ago when their own love story had truly begun. "I love you too," Martha replied, her heart as full as it had been on that first night when she had finally found the courage to claim the happiness that had been waiting for her all along. As the celebration continued around them, Martha and James stood together watching their daughter begin her own journey into love and partnership, secure in the knowledge that they had given her the best possible foundation for whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. They had proven that love could triumph over circumstance, that authentic happiness was possible for those brave enough to claim it, and that sometimes the most unconventional choices led to the most extraordinary lives. The mountains stretched around them in all directions, eternal and unchanging, witnesses to the love story that had transformed 3 lives and created a legacy that would endure for generations to come. In the end, Martha reflected, she had found everything she had never dared to dream of in the arms of a man who had forgotten how to dream at all. And together they had built something that would stand as proof that love, when it is real and deep and true, can overcome any obstacle and create miracles that echo through time.